So this is our third monthly session of Quaker core beliefs. This one is the direct experience of God. The first one we did, there is living, dynamic, spiritual presence at work in the world, which is both within us and outside of us. And then the second one, there is that of God in everyone. And for tonight, I'll do a brief intro, play a Quaker speak, and then Patricia will present each person as capable of a direct and unmediated experience of God, and then we'll have sharing. And Martha and Sean have agreed to be guest speakers. After that, the floor is open, everybody to please share their thoughts. The next session will be Wednesday, May 31st. Well, I was going to do housekeeping first. Let me see if I can. Yep. So very briefly, I think we've all done this before, but please use the, I'm looking for the word now, where you raise your hand. I'm not seeing it in front of me, but anyway, please raise your hand if you would like to offer, and we encourage feedback at gcmmlincoln@gmail.com. Any thoughts that you may have. So I'm going to go to Quaker Speak now.
What I have found again and again is that there are moments where I'm able to make enough space to listen to that still small voice, to that inward voice of Christ that leads me into a different way of living, a different way of loving in the world.
First Friends, especially George Fox, the core of their message was Christ has come to teach his people himself. It's not a theological thing. Friends experienced unmediated discipleship. Just like Peter followed Jesus and heard Jesus' voice, got the teachings direct, had to encounter Jesus' personality for good and ill. That's what Friends are experiencing. So that was the inward teacher. Fascinatingly, just like the Holy Spirit spoke through the apostles at the Pentecost in such a way that everybody heard the Spirit speaking in their own language, so too the Christ Spirit in all ages has been speaking in ways that people could understand in their situation and in their time.
So the still small voice is about us understanding that when we still ourselves and quiet ourselves, and I think part of it's like making ourselves not be the center of the story, like that I am not the center of the story.
I think it's helpful to remember that for most of us, we don't see writing on the wall. Most of us don't hear a vocal leading. Most of us don't frequently have these like dynamic mystical experiences, although they happen.
So we have to be quiet. We have to lean forward and say, oh, yes.
When I listen, when I really listen, I am listening to hear God speak. I am listening for God's voice, God's signal. What that means to me is the signal that moves me to aliveness.
So the still small voice might be consolation. It also might be reproof. It also might be inspiration or challenge or encouragement. I get a sense of a way forward and a comfortableness in my body, mind, spirit, which is saying, yes, that's not just you, although I have to be part of that co-creation, but that's God speaking to me, the inward Christ, the inward teacher.
Now, that inward teacher, we also believe, has been present in all ages and in all people, because the inward teacher is another way of talking about the inward light. And that's the Christ spirit at work in all ages. If you follow John, which friends like to do, the Gospel of John, I mean.
It's been my experience that the most clear invitations to live in a way that is about love and wholeness come in a voice that is very easy to ignore. That it's very easy for me to let my ego, let my fears, my anxieties, the ways that I'm bound up govern the way I live my life.
It's almost as if the energy of the soul, in all of its power and its richness and its movement, that which has the capacity to create universes. My belief is we have a tendency to suppress it.
And so oftentimes I think it's important that we learn to quiet it enough to discern the Spirit's Christ's pattern of speaking to us.
Finding ways to really locate that energy and allowing it to come forth. It's a power. It's a power. And that power, in order to break through the ego structures and the racisms and the classisms and the homophobiaisms and all those isms, in order for spirit to come through that, there's this aliveness and power that pushes up and out, and the body quakes. That's one way of accessing it.
Putting the still small voice at the center looks like not doing anything until it's clear, until you're truly led.
Even if it's telling me I must do something I am not happy about maybe engaging in, or even if that is a discomfort place, I still will have the sense of comfort and calm. There's a sense of a deeper peace that accompanies those commands or those encouragements.
Okay, thank you, friends. I'm going to do my little bit right here and then turn it over to Patricia. So my discernment about the question of unmediated contact with God, or message from God, or light from God, led me to a reading from 1985 New England Yearly Meeting. The divine light is accessible to all people, regardless of race, sex, age, or material wealth. Everyone has the potential to respond to God within. Equality is not sameness, it is equality of respect. Every person is a child of God. So I didn't share my screen. Sorry about that. Getting in and out of PowerPoint is a little bit of a nuance, and I'm used to just Xing out of a window, and that doesn't work. What I wanted to share, and the reason I chose that reading is, for me, the voice of God, the light of God, comes when I have an opportunity to attest to my faith or share with another a faith experience that I might have had. Back in January, we had a second hour, and I found myself, I arrived late and I was sitting there sort of quaking for the whole hour and a half. And at the end, I found myself standing up. And the two things I remember saying was, whatever word you use to refer to God, we are all in God's house. And I shared some of my feelings and ended with the statement, there is no room for fear in God's house. And I thought I was speaking to the topic that we were all talking about, but that presence kept coming back to me. And those were not cognitive words. It wasn't like I stood up prepared to say there is no room for fear in God's house. And the more I reflected on it, my discernment is that I am God's house. God's spirit resides in me, and there's no room for fear in me. And that was, to me, the light speaking and giving me a message that doesn't have anything to do with my thoughts or my judgments. That's totally a direct message from God. And other times it's just sort of spontaneous. You don't know when it's going to happen, but you're sharing some joy with someone else. And then all of a sudden the feeling between you sort of elevates. And like when we went into silence tonight, I felt immediately some spiritual presence. So that's my testament to God speaking through me. Thank you. Patricia?
Sure. Okay, I'm going to do a little screen share here, just because I have a number of quotes, which I think would be just useful for people to actually see. So let me see if I can do this. Okay, hold on. Where are we here? Share. What are we seeing here? Okay, let's get this into.
I saw it for a minute.
Can you not see it now?
No, I don't see it now.
Disappeared. Okay, let's try this again. Hold on, I know what the problem is, I think. Okay. Okay, can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Perfect. That looks good.
Right. So every person is capable of the direct and immediate experience of God. That is what Friend Larrabee said in the 21st century. George Fox's words were, Christ has come to teach his people himself. This is the foundational belief of the Quaker faith tradition. When people ask us, what do Quakers believe? Instead of saying there is that of God in everyone, we should say this: every person is capable of the direct and unmediated experience of God. All else comes from this: our way of worshiping, our method of making decisions, our testimonies, the way we are led to live our lives. We are called to so order our lives that we are living constantly in the presence of the inward Christ, our antenna always tuned to the guidance of that holy mystery, in a state of receptive awareness to a God-saturated cosmos. The idea that we can directly experience the divine does not seem to be that radical an idea in the 21st century, especially since today most denominations and spiritual paths accept this as true, even if they strive to contain the direct experience within the guardrails of creeds and orthodoxies. You could even say that this is what is meant by those people who say they are spiritual but not religious. Skip the religion and go straight to mystery. In the mid-17th century, however, when Quakerism was founded, this was a radical belief that not only had spiritual and private consequences, but political and public ones as well. I believe that always seeking, experiencing, and being guided by that presence which is both within us and beyond us, which constitutes the very ground of our being, is no less radical and necessary today than it was 370 years ago. George Fox was born in 1624 and grew up in a deeply devout Anglican family. His father was called Christa or Christa because he was so devout. That meant that his knowledge of God and truth was taught to him by his parish priest in the consecrated environment of the church, using the liturgy and rites adapted from the Catholic Mass by the Church of England at the time of the Reformation. But this was no ordinary era. It was great political, social, and religious change, an apocalyptic time not unlike our own. During Fox's growing up years, England was in the throes of a civil war, and in 1642, when Fox was 25, the king, supposedly appointed by God to be the head of the state and the church, was beheaded. It is small wonder that young George felt a deep dissatisfaction with the supposed truths he had grown up with. He was simply not prepared to accept on face value the prevailing customs and beliefs of his time and place. He and many others, particularly the young, and the Quaker movement was a young person's movement largely, we forget that, felt a deep spiritual hunger, despair, and desolation. Does this sound familiar? When he was just 18, Fox set about seeking a more authentic way to live. He embarked on the age-old mission of finding himself. He began by asking questions of the experts, the Anglican priests with their grand qualifications from Oxford and Cambridge, who supposedly had all the answers, who defined right belief, who interpreted the scriptures on behalf of their congregation, and, it must be added, who owed their livelihoods to the tithes that all people of property were required to pay. But young George was not satisfied with their answers. He saw a yawning gap between the teachings of Jesus and the so-called way that believers live their lives, something I think we can all relate to. Finding no help from the official experts, he engaged with separatist preachers, in particular the newly hatched Baptists, the Baptist church was only about 50 years old at this time, a path his uncle followed. But these folks also could not, to use his phrase, speak to his condition. After years of searching, he was desperate and discouraged. But then, in his spiritual and psychological poverty, God spoke to him. And when all my hopes in all men were gone, so that I had nothing outwardly to help me, nor could tell what to do, then, oh then, I heard a voice which said, there is one, even Christ Jesus, that can speak to my condition. And when I heard it, my heart did leap for joy. Christ, Fox said, had come to teach his people himself. No priest, no pastor, no interpreter, no teacher, no special rites or worldly ordination was necessary. All people, the rich, the poor, the learned, the illiterate, even those from other nations and other religions, can learn directly and inwardly what God has to teach. Moreover, Fox said, he knew this experimentally, that is experientially, that is, the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith meant nothing unless they are internalized and known inwardly in the experience of the heart. Fox did not reject the Bible. In fact, he was extraordinarily knowledgeable of the scriptures. But he found that what he experienced directly and inwardly guided his understanding of scripture and was confirmed by it. In 1652, Fox encountered a group in Lancashire known as the Westmoreland Seekers, made up of men and women undergoing the same struggles as he had been, worshipping in silence as they waited for God to reveal the path forward. Neither he nor they were looking to start a new church or Christian denomination. They were looking to recapture that direct and powerful spiritual encounter that came to Jesus' disciples at Pentecost and which lay at the heart of the first Christians' experience. Fox, still only 28 years old, utterly transformed by the revelations he had received, articulated what the seekers were searching for, and the Quaker movement was born. One of his early converts, or one of the early convinced friends, Francis Howgill, expressed it, "The kingdom of heaven did gather us up and catch us all and as in a net, and his heavenly power at one time drew many hundreds to land. We came to know a place to stand in and what to wait him. Within a decade, Quakerism was the most successful religious alternative in Great Britain to the established church. It was estimated that in Bristol, 1 in 10 people were Quakers at that time, within the 1660s and 1670s, which is remarkable. It also became one of the most controversial. If every person could receive direct revelation from God, then every person, male or female, could preach the word. If all were equal in this respect, then social distinctions, so fundamental to British society, were not only irrelevant, but blasphemous. Churches were unnecessary. George Fox referred to them as steeple houses, and those supposedly qualified to preach in them were dismissed as hireling preachers. From there, it was a very short step to refusing to pay tithes. No amount of imprisonment, beatings, persecution, or loss of property could deter these early friends, and hundreds died in the grim dungeons of British prisons. But they were on fire. I sense the same hunger today. In our world, especially among our young people, the nuns who have soundly and for good reason rejected the pieties of organized religion and the unquestioning belief in what could be called the American orthodoxy of capitalism, what mostly worked for their parents and grandparents does not seem to be working for them. Truth itself in this era of unbridled information overload and ubiquitous social media has become slippery and elusive. It has become a market commodity. Our lives and beliefs are no less mediated than those people living in the 17th century. But for most of us, they are mediated not by religious authorities, but by opinion makers, influencers, by politicians, by marketers competing for our attention. Increasingly, our life experiences are less deep and direct and more superficial and secondhand as we spend more and more time in front of screens, hopefully this instance accepted, being entertained and distracted to death. What Quakerism says is that there is another way to live. It is possible to turn always to the source in which resides unimaginable richness and peace, guidance and clarity. For 370 years, those faithful to the Quaker path have discovered that if we, in Fox's words, stand still in the light, or in Isaac Pennington's words, sink down to the seed, we can redirect our awareness to that holy presence that is the very ground of our being, where we can find meaning, the deep-rooted joy, and the love that builds up and heals. George Fox expressed it this way: "Sing and rejoice, you children of the day and of the light, for the Lord is at work in this thick night of darkness that may be felt." So the question before us, as it was in Fox's day, is how do we have that direct, unmediated encounter with the divine? This is why we talk about Quakerism as a faith practice rather than a religion. We are called always to return to what 20th century Thomas Kelly called the amazing inner sanctuary of the soul, a holy place, a divine center, a speaking voice. It is a seed stirring to life if we do not choke it. Quaker faith and practice are based on the confidence that the Spirit of Christ, the light within, is present to guide the individual and the worshiping group at all times, and that this guidance can only be perceived inwardly. It cannot come to us filtered through the minds of others and is not subject to the intellect. That is to say that we cannot seek inspiration from others, be it books, discussions, or vocal ministry. But these merely help to open the door to direct experience that goes beyond words. So it's not to say we cannot seek inspiration from these sources. Ultimately, what we hear or read should be held in the silence that we may be guided inwardly to its truth as understood and supported by our experience. This is why Quaker worship is sometimes described as waiting worship. Waiting demands a humility and patience that can be very hard to achieve in our fast-paced, action-oriented, highly individualistic age. But as we wait, we are sometimes able to drop into a consciousness of deeper life, which has the power to transform our perception of truth and our way of being in the world. I think it is remarkable that such an inward turning faith practice should result in such dynamic outward service. Our silent waiting is not simply an opportunity to recharge or find personal peace, although these are among the happy fruits of Quaker practice. No, as William Penn wrote, true godliness don't turn men out of the world, but enables them to live better in it and excites their endeavor to mend it. Isaac Pennington, one of my favorite early Quakers, describes it this way: give over thine own willing, give over thine own running, give over thine own desiring to know or be anything, and sink down to the seed which God sows in the heart, and let that grow in thee, and be in thee, and breathe in thee, and act in thee. And thou shalt find by sweet experience that the Lord knows that, and loves and owns that, and will lead to the inheritance of life, which is its portion. For much of my life, and certainly in my years of spiritual search, I longed for a road to Damascus experience. Like Saul, I wanted to be cast to the ground and have the voice of God tell me what was true. From then on, I assumed it would be plain sailing. I would rise fully spiritually realized, able to live my life with my God facts straight. But here's the thing. I have had that experience. Some of you have heard me tell of this before because it is so central to my spiritual journey and has informed my life ever since it occurred. So please, if you have heard this before, please bear with me. One ordinary fall day back in 2011, the police came to our home and in front of me arrested my 21-year-old son on a charge of dealing drugs. As it turned out, he had been caught selling some of his attention deficit medications, not exactly heroin, but still a felony. My carefully constructed world of perfect parenting and uprightness in the community immediately fell apart. Like Saul, I was at least figuratively thrown to the ground, absolutely shattered. I had to call my husband, who was on business in New York, and call him home. I had to go with my dear friend Catherine to pick my son up from the police station. I was scheduled to go to Pendle Hill for a 5-day workshop, and I immediately called to cancel. As a family, we were in a realm that we just had never thought we would be in. My husband, my son, my daughter, and I. But then I received what I can only call a strong prompting from the Spirit that I was to go to Pendle Hill. So I went, although in such poverty of spirit as I had never experienced. While at Pendle Hill, I was sitting one day in meeting for worship, hollowed out of everything that had kept me, I guess, psychologically upright for my whole life, but filled with anxiety and shame. As I waited in the silence, I felt a powerful inbreathing of the Spirit. My hollowness was filled. It was so powerful that it brought me to my feet, and I was literally quaking. The voice I heard inwardly said, "Do not be afraid, let go. You are not alone. Neither is your son, nor your husband, nor your daughter, nor your family. I am always with you." My anxiety disappeared, and I felt a deep joy and reassurance. The story unfolded, and it turned out, in fact, to be one of the best things that happened for my son. It certainly brought me to a new understanding of my role as a parent was not to control, but to let go. We experienced love, and it brought us together. From that day to this, I have never lost that sense of being accompanied. The presence is as close as my breath. At times, if I let myself get too caught up in the world, that sense burns lower. but it never quite goes out. And if I am faithful to my Quaker practice of waiting in the light that keeps open the door of awareness, I can feel the power expressed by the prophet Isaiah. But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary. And they shall walk and not faint. I believe that in the course of every human life, with all its toils and troubles, we are given opportunities for the big road to Damascus experiences, and that our Quaker practice prepares us to recognize and receive them. But life is made up mostly of smaller, more quotidian opportunities to live into constant awareness of the light. This means slowing down, developing mindfulness, accepting the limits of our human knowledge, opening up space for the divine presence to come in, and as we are able, letting go of everything that distracts us from living into the hidden unity with eternal being. From that hidden unity, we can more easily discern how we are to live, what work we are to put our hands to, and the way in which we are to do it. In closing, I'd like to go back to the idea that the first Quakers were not out to create a new religion, but were sharing a powerful and life-transforming experience that they believed was open to everyone, regardless of what labels they wore. It seems fitting at this point to quote a non-Quaker, non-Christian, who lived a deeply simple life on the banks of the Ohio River. In his short biography of the artist Harlan Hubbard, the writer Wendell Berry includes this quote from Hubbard's diary. Much as I admire the Christian principles and teaching and the people who follow them, for myself, I require a more direct revelation, not one that must come through so many minds before it reaches mine. I must have a faith that I can see and hear, one that I can feel without thinking or even trying to put it into words. It is not for anyone else, it is a personal faith. The strange thing is that it leads to conduct that I think could be called Christian. Thank you. If anybody has any questions or anything about the history or whatever, I'd be happy to answer them.
Any questions? Well, we have two guest friends presenting tonight. So Martha, would you like to start?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. I would say I'm sorry that I haven't been able to make the other sessions, but I hope that you all don't feel I'm a guest, that I'm a part of
Oh, sorry.
our community. And not in
Martha, the
not in
worst.
any bad way. I'm saying that I just and I'm in that world of craziness and way too busyness, and seen by my being late tonight. And I so agree with what was said before, that it's very difficult to sense the light when you cannot still yourself. I hold on to practices that allow me to still myself. But in looking back over my life, I think it's instructive for me anyway to think about how I got to where I am today, and the practice and the way that I experience the light today. So the earliest that I can remember having any kind of what I felt was a religious experience was I was up in the Berkshires of Massachusetts and on a summer camp, and we'd been on some kind of field trip out in nature. I think we camped out at Mount Monadnock and climbed the mountain. We came back and we stopped at this place called the Cathedral of the Pines. It may still be there. I don't know. And I just remember I felt like I was alone, like everybody had gone back to the bus, and I just couldn't drag myself away from this beautiful spot. But it was the scent of the pine and the stillness of the place that gave me a sense of awe and peace that I had never felt before. And I was probably, I don't know, 10 years old or something. So I just saw, I soaked that in. It just came, I think it kind of became a part of me. And then when I was in middle school and high school, I used to play guitar at Catholic folk masses, which was wonderful fun. You know, I loved to play guitar, and they were nice songs. And it was there's a beauty to the Catholic folk mass that was meaningful. But then they would always have the communion, and I couldn't do that because I was not one of them. And I really, I guess I was hurt kind of by that, right? What's wrong with me? Why can't I access this secret thing that they all get to do? When I was growing up as a Methodist, and I took communion over there. So it was a questioning then at that point, like, okay. And I got involved in peace work during the Vietnam War in high school. And you guys have heard me talk about Pete Seeger was from my hometown, and he was very anti-war and also very pro-environment. So there was a lot of building of experience in those years, in a way of opening my heart to the broader world and beyond my teenage, ego self. And when I got to Duke, I joined this group called Student for Nonviolent Study and Action, and really learned for the first time the concept of reflection, that you act out of reflection, and that, you don't just go out and do something. You need to know where that's coming from. You need to touch base with the love within you, so that the action that you take, even if it's a protest or an angry, seems that it comes from a place of love. I've always, at some point, I took Bible study in college and came upon the phrase "God is love" for the first time, and I went, well, that's it for me. And you guys have heard me speak about that as well, I'm sure, over the years. A number of you have. But I also sang in the chapel choir, which brought just, I guess, one of those quotes somebody put up, "Sing and rejoice," that there was a joy there, that I felt the presence of the Spirit in that place and in the singing with other people. And I found my way to the Durham Friends meeting. So that was my first experience with Quakers. And there was a kindness and an openness to that community for these. And I went with a friend, these two hippies that were like college students. Nobody else. These were families, that were part of this community. And here these two college kids come wandering in, and they so enveloped us, and we became involved in their community, and in a way that I began to learn the Quaker testimonies and began to practice Quakerism for the first time. So when I found Goose Creek, after I had my children, I came to this area and had my children, I really was reaching out for something that could allow me to share a faith that I could feel really comfortable and believe in with my children. And so when I came to Goose Creek, it just allowed me to deepen my faith and my practice. And I found myself being able to appreciate the silence and the silent worship, and becoming attuned to, I don't know if it's a still small voice that I would characterize it as, because when I feel like I'm going to need to speak, I really do get shoved up. I really do. And I feel like the real need to speak. It doesn't happen very often, as you guys probably know, but when it does, I'm like, okay, you want me to say that? And it really does come from not a I think I hear this message that needs to be shared, and I examine that message. And maybe we've talked about vocal ministry, or maybe you all have talked about that or will, but I don't examine it real critically because it wasn't my message. And so I just try to make it something that I can offer in a way that might make a little sense, or be able to touch people in the way that it touched me when I felt it come to me. And so I just, the practice is one that is just essential to my life now. And I loved the woman, I forget what meeting she was in the video, that talked about feeling a sense of comfort and peace. Is not always that, but when I can touch that, it really does help me with a way to live it helps me know how to go out into the week. And I just had to just share one more thing, I guess, that I feel like that someone else has said, it's always there. And for me, I never know when I'm gonna hear that voice. And I guess somebody on there said they don't hear a voice. I don't know if it's a voice, but somebody's telling me something. I mean, a message is coming to me. And I was having a really difficult time. Again, I apologize for people who heard this one, but this is a really pivotal experience for me. Really difficult time at my last job. And I was being put in a situation where my integrity and my professionalism and the core of who I am was being challenged by somebody I really didn't know, but was in a position of but was in a position of power over me, and was very it was a very aggressive criticism. And I like, how do I respond to that? I really was just such at a loss, because I don't like conflict, and I'm not that kind of person. But I just wanted to know what do I do? Not to defend myself, but just how do I be out of this? How do I respond in a way that shows this person who I am? And I honestly did get the most clear message that I've ever had, that you know who you are, and nobody can take that away from you, and that love within you is what just needs to guide everything that you do. And you can if you can just stay true to that person and let your life speak, which is one of my favorite Quaker sayings. If you can just let your life speak out of that love, then even if it doesn't have the desired result over that person, then you can still know that you're living your Quaker values of integrity. And so for me, that was such a comfort. And I'm able to reinforce and to strengthen this practice and this ability, I think, to touch that light and share it in this community of friends. We talk sometimes about, well, you could just sit at home and do this, right? You can meditate, you can read, you can whatever, but it's different. And I think those of us who've been in the community and keep coming back, that we appreciate that difference of being together in the light and listening for and how we minister to each other. I guess that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Sean?
Yeah, I was so absorbed by what Martha's saying. I feel like I forgot where I'm supposed to start.
We'll take a breath.
Yeah. So I'm a little newer to Goose Creek meeting. I've been attending with my daughter for think 4, maybe 5 years, somewhere in that time. And it really was a long time in the making. And we kind of arrived at the point as a family where it was, where the door had finally opened for me to be able to do this. And I had always kind of, for many years, felt that this was coming. But it's interesting how I even found out about Quakerism, given that my grandmother was a Quaker, and that was really never talked about. But I'm going to roll back a little bit further. But my upbringing, I was baptized Presbyterian, and then later confirmed in the Methodist Church. And my parents basically required that I go to church every Sunday and attend most of the youth group events. But they were pretty hands-off when it came to my religious education. And they didn't really force a whole lot on me, and they definitely didn't force any particular belief on me. So I was still free to explore what I believed within that context, and especially mainly the Methodist Church. But by the time I became a teenager, I think we all questioned, day to day, what was going to happen with me. It was an extremely difficult time for all of us. And I was on the surface doing well. I was doing well in school, did sports, everything looked fine, but I was fighting with my parents almost every night, and it could be like 2 or 3 hours. And somehow I was still, staying up to get homework done. And it was, I often think back to that and wonder and hope that I didn't take a few years off their life. I would fast forward a little bit, that my parents and I get along wonderfully now, and they live in Winchester, and we hang out all the time and love each other dearly. So I guess, everything turned out well. But back then, I really felt torn in two. And often the only real thing I had to turn to was going for really long walks. And it was all hours of the day. It could be any time. It could be in the middle of the night. And I had frequent conversations with police officers who were checking in on me as I was kind of really just roaming around, most of the time without my parents knowing that I was out of the house. But I wasn't attracted to drugs or alcohol. It really, I feel like I was at least abiding by those rules with them. But I am still amazed that they never knew. Often didn't know I was gone. And it was on a few of these walks where I had my real, first experiences of God. And it was really at the moments where I felt that everything kind of was falling apart. Like I just kind of felt a little bit insane, really, and just kind of didn't understand how to make sense or really resolve all of this. And so, I for me, it wasn't a voice. It was just kind of this sudden, overwhelming kind of presence that just felt loving and just supportive. And it just seemed to be getting this message that everything's going to be fine. And this wasn't, frequent, but it did happen a few times. And, many years later, when I learned the word grace, it immediately made sense to me that it was the sense of being loved and cared for at the moment when I felt least deserving of it. And for my teenage years, at least, it made me at least feel life was worth living. It prevented me from giving up hope, and also, thankfully, it prevented me from hardening myself against my parents. We had a tough time of it, and when I went off to college, it was kind of maybe a little bit of a welcome break for all of us, but things didn't shut down completely. But those experiences for me were really different from what I was hearing described in church. It felt like completely different experiences. And later, when I went on to college, I tended to overload my schedules every semester and always kind of managed to squeeze in a religion class. And my senior year, I realized that I had accumulated enough of these courses to have a minor in religion without even realizing it. But I never declared it, didn't really care to go through the steps for that. But I was taking classes in Buddhism and Hinduism, a number in Christianity. I took an Old Testament class where I was way in over my head. I felt like the least knowledgeable person, least prepared person in that whole room. And often wondered why I would keep throwing myself on this fire, so to speak, right? But I learned a lot from all of those faith traditions, but there was always this pull bringing me back to Christianity. And even though, my Christian friends would say I was maybe a belief or two short of being a full Christian, I still felt a real cultural connection to it and a real kind of, inheritance through my family of Christian values. So I always found myself comfortable in a Christian church, but like my friend said, I was, a believer too short of it. So the Quakerism part, my first experience to Quakerism was in high school, and a friend invited me to join her and her family at the Winchester meeting, I guess the Hopewell meeting. It was the meeting house downtown, not the one out in the countryside. And I honestly had no idea what I was walking into. And at this point, I didn't even know my grandmother was a Quaker. But when I got home, of course, my parents said, "Hey, your grandmother's a Quaker." And I was like, "Really?" But that was all that was really said. It was kind of more like a historical curiosity, I think, than it was anything that really resonated with either of my parents. And but that day at the Quaker meeting, it's definitely planted a seed. It was completely unlike anything I'd been to before. And just the act of sitting there in silence, the kind of the centeredness and the focus I felt when somebody else stood up to share something. It was different than when a pastor gives a sermon. For me, the experience of a sermon, I find, brings up a lot of almost like debates in my head. I find myself resisting the sermon, even if it's perfectly fine. But when someone stands up in the middle of silence and shares kind of a personal reflection, it had a way of reaching out to me in a way that I just didn't forget. There was just kind of like a sincerity and an authenticity about a Quaker meeting for worship that stuck with me. But it was still, many years before I would find my way to Goose Creek. I knew about Goose Creek for a long time before I started attending regularly. And really grateful to be here now and was extremely grateful when my daughter of her own choosing asked to join me on Sundays. So that's been fantastic. But when I'm thinking about this belief, this direct kind of experience of God, I mean, in a way, that's kind of where I felt like I had started with those experiences in high school. But there's a couple things that come out from this. It's interesting because, like, for me, the belief with God is that feels deep and internal for me. And when I think about this direct experience, it almost appeals kind of almost to the more rational, kind of practical side for me. And it's the thing that I feel the most with this is that it encourages a personal responsibility. It encourages and maybe even requires me to tend to that experience, to tend to that relationship with God. And that this really, I mean, I would say definitely from my earliest days, I felt stuff like this, I just couldn't outsource to others. I just couldn't. And I felt distrustful a lot of times in church when I saw people ingratiating themselves with the pastor. It wasn't the pastor's fault. The pastor was perfectly fine. But there was this sense that sometimes people were kind of almost handing over their responsibility, and that if they were good with the pastor, then that somehow rubbed off on them. And it was even more intense in a meditation retreat I went to, where there was a Tibetan Lama, and it was someone I had met at work invited me. And it was mostly a room of white people, along with the Tibetan entourage that was up on the stage. And on a break, we were going outside, and there was a woman genuinely wondering what was going to happen to her life when the Lama went away. And in his presence, she felt like all her answers were there, but when he was gone, she was genuinely worried about where things would head for her. And so from my experience, it's always been the opposite. It's something I feel important for me to tend to. It's asking those questions, like the queries that we ask as Quakers. Am I aligned with God, or am I kind of turning my back on that experience? Am I turning my back and being selfish and harmful to those around me, to myself, or to the world, right? So it's always been kind of central to me to keep that aspect of personal responsibility and being accountable to it. But there's also, and this is something I have been thinking about for a long time, and I'm going to try to keep this part short, because I really feel like I can go down a lot of rabbit holes with this, but it really does demand this different way of being in community with others. When everybody has this access to this direct, can have this direct experience of God, it kind of puts us all on a level, on the same level. And it's not like one person is more important than another. And for the last, I don't know, 7 or 8 years, I've really been involved in a lot of communities that are focused on decentralized protocols. And these ideas of intermediation or disintermediation, and centralization and decentralization are discussed quite a bit from a number of angles. And these are protocols that are kind of like the internet protocols, like TCP/IP, if you have any idea what that is. But these groups go through very similar kinds of debates, and it's almost like I sometimes can imagine what maybe some early Quakers kind of maybe had to go through. And there's a lot of discussion around some of these groups about, centralizing, getting a lead figure or an organization that can market them and explain them to the world. And there's and when they do that, they have some success, and everybody cheers, and they're excited that they can now move faster and get things done faster. But they've kind of lost track of what some of the more important things were. And so there's precious few groups that maintain that kind of leaderless group that's full of lots of leaders. In fact, like it's such an ethos in those groups that when newcomers come up, these groups, which are largely online, they communicate a lot in memes. And so one of the memes is, "Hi, I'm new here, and I'm here to fix everything." And that person is maybe a few weeks short of finding out that nobody wants them to lead them, and they're going to have to figure out a different way of contributing. And it's this whole idea of kind of having a leaderless group of people who all have innate qualities to lead. It's unique. And it's very difficult for most people to understand just how much tending it requires, and that a couple things that it does require just fundamentally is listening more, and really kind of focusing on listening to others, and in some cases, you know, sitting silent long enough to maybe earn the right to speak. But it also forces kind of like a longer term view that I think is really important. And it's this sense that, you know, not everything that comes to our mind to do today necessarily needs to be done today, and that sometimes the dust has to settle before we tackle certain ideas, and that sometimes it takes maybe years and years to settle the question. And one of these days, I want to hear the whole story about the air conditioning. Emma was telling me about the air conditioning at Goose Creek that Perry was sharing with the kids in first day school. So I think I got sort of a translation of it. I think a lot of the details were missing, but you know, sometimes it does take, I guess it was 9 years or so for things like that to happen. But the way you get there does matter. So there's many more weird coincidences and things of how my interests that I've developed over my life have had a very nice fit with Quakerism. And I'm just constantly surprised as I'm working through first day school lessons, you know, just how many unintended connections there are.
Thank you, Sean. Well, we've got a room full of good listeners. Who would like to hit the reactions button and tell us your thoughts? Well, we have a query to get folks started. I'm going to put it on the screen. Whoops. What did I? Oh, I closed the window. Sorry, I'll be right back.
It reminds me of, I have this centering prayer group I go to on Monday evenings, and we do this Lectio Divina, you know, which is basically you discuss a passage of the Bible or a poet, you know, typically Bible, but you can do poetry or anything. And people share out of the silence. You have meditation, and then you share out of the silence about this passage. And sometimes it's very quiet. And I remember after nobody wanted to talk or share, one of the guys goes, "This must be what Quaker meeting is like." You know, we're more comfortable with silence. If nobody's not going to say anything, that's okay. We can appreciate that as well.
Absolutely. Okay. Why am I?
I have really appreciated, as I have, you know, one of the wonderful things about Quakerism is you can look outside of Quakerism for spiritual inspiration. And the number of times that I have found inspiration from mystical traditions that are not Quakers, the Catholic mystical tradition, Thomas Merton, Richard Rohr, there's an Episcopal mystical tradition, there is the Sufis, so that the things that the Quakers have discovered, in fact, have been discovered, certainly, by people wearing different labels.
So query number 1, how does God speak to you? How do you know the source is spirit-led and not ego-led?
I can share a little personal
Gene?
story. Was I
Okay,
supposed to
go ahead, Sue.
raise my hand?
No, we got you. Go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you.
I feel that God has been speaking to me my whole life, and leading me on a journey of continuing discovery. And I didn't grow up in a household that was particularly religious, and was often just dropped off at Sunday school. And our family didn't really attend church. And I didn't have a real good experience as a child with religion. But I knew there was something out there for me. I just didn't know how to access it. So throughout my life, I think it's been a growth experience of continuing to listen to the still small voice within me, as I've been led through a variety of religions and experiences, and finally ended up with the Quakers. And I never would have imagined that I would find a home in the Quaker faith. And when it happened, it just felt right. And I felt that God was leading me in this direction. It just took a long time.
At least a long time in our calendar. Jean, I saw you had your hand up.
I apologize for not being having my picture, but it's
No worries.
this week. I think Sue really kind of expressed a lot of what I would say. I think ego-centered ideas that usually if I come up with, I think the spirit-led is out of my comfort zone, which is when I really know that I am being spirit-led, that it's something that's a little more, not always hugely difficult, but not my first choice. And my first choice often is, after it seasons a bit, has to be rejected. I don't always get it right, of course, but I think getting uncomfortable is a good indication that I'm being spirit-led.
Thank you. Absolutely true. Anyone else like to share? Oh. Paris, Gail?
I wanted to go back to Sean's question about the air conditioning, because I was there through the whole thing. I was recording clerk. And I think what I most remember about it now is the loving way in which it was handled. Nobody got mad. The person who was wanting air conditioning was a dearly beloved member of the meeting, and he was always treated with courtesy and love and kind of sorrow that we couldn't go along, or at that time we couldn't agree to put in air conditioning. But it was something. I mean, okay, it took 9 years, but we learned a lot. I learned a lot. And I'm sorry that other people didn't, some of you weren't here to experience how to deal with something as lovingly as we did.
Thank you, Sue Ellen. That's a good memory. I
Yeah.
saw Terry and Gail, the hand went up.
I've always thought that God speaks to us through what we love, that there's an individual language for each one of us. And I remember once I was very naughty in Sunday school and I was being punished. I had to sit out in the car while my mother went and apologized for my bad behavior to the Sunday school teacher. And at the same time in school, I was learning about identifying birds. And I looked out the window and I saw a flicker. And I was so excited. It was the first flicker I ever saw. And my heart, it said to me, I'm not a terrible person. There's a loving sense out there. And when I come to those things about spirit-led or ego, and I don't know, I've just decided, well, in my intention, I intend this to be in the spirit. And oh, heck, I'm just going to go ahead and do it. And I'll find out. Yeah. Yes. And God does honor it somehow.
I like that. Thank you, Gail. Ashley?
There we go. I'm on my iPhone and I can't switch back easily. What a great question. I think that the times that I am more spirit-led, like the answer is just there. And when it's ego-led, I am a very analytical person and I work myself in circles and the pros and the cons list and here. And, you know, my ego-led decisions are the right ones, right? Because I've gone through the whole process and tried to figure it out. And the spirit-led's often maybe even in conflict with what my ego-led answer would be. And I can't fight the con list. Like the con list may be there analytically, but there's just not an argument to be had. You just feel like, well, all these other people might look at this decision and disagree or not understand, or I can't like debate my way through it properly. It just is what it is. So I think it's in those moments where I'm fighting my ego so hard that I know that it must not be the right way. So I don't know if it's so much that the spirit-led is like the clearer answer. It's that I'm fighting the ego so much, like I can't still be comfortable with the end answer, if that makes sense from like the analytical way. There's just a different level of peace, even if I can't make sense of why or how I got there. So that would maybe be, it's a great question. It's very hard to think about how you sort through those. So that's a good thought. Thank you.
Thank you. Sounds like discernment to me. Okay.
I can't find my my hand, so
We got you, Sheila. Thank you.
Somewhere, one of the things that Patricia spoke of was Isaac Pennington's talking about sink down to the seed. And that has been going in my head the entire time we've been talking, because it reminds me, I came to the deepest thinking of my life through psychology, through therapy, through ways of kind of, as Jung would say, peeling away the persona, how you look at the world, how the world looks at you, how you act for the world, or ego, what I want, and coming down to what Jung talked about as the self. And somehow, when I can be there, when I can be free of what do people think or what do words mean, because I have a lot of trouble with words like God or like belief or, do I mean what you mean sort of thing. But when I can really get down to it, it's when I feel part of the whole, when I feel like I'm just part of the energy of the universe. And I think to me, that's the divine. And I can't put traditional words to it because they're a barrier for me.
Thank you.
Chuck? Put my hand up here. For me, the tip off, if something is ego-led, is if I'm trying to control the result. I'm trying to control the outcome. It took me a long time to realize that this was, and I believe this was a spirit-led, uncomfortable spirit-led discovery, is I like control and I like to be able to control outcomes and to let go, which was the major message in that experience with my son, has been a very deep lesson for me, one that I have to keep reminding myself of. So
Thank you. Well, we had a second query, but I think one was enough. Everybody anyone else have thoughts to share tonight?
I just want to say that this whole gathering, I feel so spirit-led. I mean, just people in our community to speak from their hearts and the experiences, the variety and the huge variety and differences of experiences we have just enrich my life to be part of your lives. And I really appreciate everyone being here and together for this. I really do.
Amen. Thank you, Martha. Well, with those divine words, let's close in silence. I don't want to miss any hands. Anybody else? Okay, we can leave when you feel led. Thank you. Look forward to seeing you next month. Thanks, everybody.